Muy buenos días, estimados participantes. Sean bienvenidos a la conferencia Filantropía en China, Evolución, actores y lecciones, coorganizado por el Centro de Estudios sobre China y Asia-Pacífico de la Universidad del Pacífico y la Misión Jesuita en el Perú. Mi nombre es José Carlos Feliciano, subdirector del centro, y voy a ser el maestro de ceremonias de este evento. Antes de iniciar con el desarrollo de la actividad, quisiera hacer básicamente dos anuncios. El primero es que este evento cuenta con traducción español-inglés, ¿no? En ese sentido, aquellos que gusten, digamos, pueden utilizar los dispositivos de traducción que fueron, digamos, entregados en la puerta. Y adicionalmente, luego de las ponencias, vamos a tener un espacio para preguntas y respuestas, por lo que, digamos, se van a repartir unas notas para que ustedes puedan escribir sus preguntas a los ponentes respectivos, ¿no? Iniciando con la sesión de apertura, tenemos en primer lugar las palabras de bienvenida del doctor Gustavo Yamada, vicerrector de Investigación de nuestra universidad, quien ofrecerá el saludo institucional a los presentes. Estimado Gustavo.
Gracias, José Carlos. Muy buenos días con todos y con todas. Me toca dar unas palabras de bienvenida en nombre de la universidad. Esta charla, esta conferencia intersecta dos temáticas que son muy importantes para la universidad. Por un lado, la filantropía. La universidad tiene una larga tradición estudiando este tema. Aquí está nuestro exrector Felipe Portocarrero, Cynthia, la directora actual del Centro de Estudios de China y Asia-Pacífico. Han sido pioneros en el estudio de este tema en el Perú, en América Latina, y luego Vicente León y Matthew Bert han seguido con esa agenda, esa tradición. Acá tengo un libro reciente de ellos hacia una nueva filantropía en el Perú y siguen trabajando en esta agenda. Por un lado, este tema de la filantropía, que como dicen ellos, citando a Aristóteles, dar dinero es fácil, pero saber a quién, cuánto, cómo y con qué propósito dar no lo es. Y por otro lado, el tema de China, que como este folleto que se les ha repartido entre sus materiales indica, tenemos todo un centro de estudios sobre China y Asia-Pacífico que ya tiene más de 12 años, siendo un centro líder de generación y difusión de conocimiento acerca de China y sus relaciones con el Perú, América Latina, y se ha consolidado como líder, no solo en el Perú, sino en la región, acerca de este tema tan presente en la actualidad y para el futuro es estratégico en el mundo. Y entonces hoy día es muy interesante que el profesor Mark Sidel una estos dos temas, la filantropía y China, y sea un experto mundial y nos traiga esta conferencia sobre la evolución, los actores y las lecciones de la filantropía en China. Así que nosotros estamos muy interesados en conocer todo lo que nos va a decir y estamos seguros de que va a ser una conferencia muy provechosa. Muchísimas gracias y bienvenidos todos.
Seguidamente tenemos las palabras de bienvenida de Gianfrando Dulanto, director ejecutivo de la Misión Jesuita en el Perú. Adelante, Gianfrando.
Gracias, José Carlos. Muy buenos días con todos, con todas. Para mí un honor estar aquí esta mañana abordando un tema que es de suma importancia para nosotros desde Misión Jesuita. Misión Jesuita es la oficina de filantropía para el desarrollo de la Compañía de Jesús en el Perú. A diario nos toca buscar financiamientos, cooperación alrededor del mundo. Y tradicionalmente, cuando estamos prestos a esta labor, miramos Estados Unidos y Europa. Y claro, uno se pregunta, ¿acaso no hay nada más allá, algo distinto a Europa y Estados Unidos? Y claro, el mundo hoy ve a China con asombro. Y cuando pensamos en China, normalmente pensamos en su rápido crecimiento económico, en su progreso tecnológico, pero pocas veces vemos algo que también está presente, ¿no? Y es la forma en cómo en China también se empieza a ejercer filantropía. Por esto es que junto al centro CECHAP hemos visto por conveniente y por muy interesante abordar este tema para que nos dé luces a todas aquellas personas que trabajamos en el ámbito de la filantropía en el Perú, para ver de tender puentes posibles con este país que nos pueda también cooperar para nuestras acciones de desarrollo local aquí en Perú. Pensar en China es pensar en muchas cosas, sin duda. Una de ellas, me parece importante, es que nos amplía la perspectiva. Como ya decía antes, conocer la realidad de un país tan distinto como es el de China, nos abre puertas, nos ayuda a pensar distinto, a pensar fuera de la caja y a ver que hay otras formas posibles también de ejercer filantropía en los países. También compartimos desafíos con China, ¿no? China es un país que tiene también grandes desafíos como nosotros, desafíos a nivel de brechas sociales, a nivel de geografía, y entonces también es un país que al mismo tiempo tiene algunas cosas en común muy interesantes con nosotros que nos podría ayudar. Sin duda, queremos que este espacio sea esto, un espacio de reflexión y un espacio también de abrir nuevas ideas. Los invito entonces a escuchar pues, la ponencia y los comentarios que vienen con mucha apertura, con mucho juicio crítico también y con agradecimiento también a quienes nos acogen para poder explorar este tema que es muy importante para muchos de nosotros que trabajamos en esos temas. Muy buenos días y bienvenidos.
Muchas gracias, Gianfranco. A continuación tenemos entonces la conferencia magistral del doctor Mark Sidel, titulada Filantropía en China, Evolución, actores y lecciones. Professor Mike Sidel is the Doyle Bascom Professor of Law and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an elected member of the American Law Institute. A leading scholar on civil society and philanthropy, he has held appointments at institutions such as the University of Liverpool, NYU, and the University of Western Australia. He has served as president of the International Society of the Third Sector Research, and Professor Sidel advises governments and major foundations on human rights, legal reform, and nonprofit regulation. And of course, he has an extensive experience in not only China, but as well in other Asian countries like Vietnam and so on. So, Professor Mike Sidel, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see old friends on my first visit to Peru, but people I've known for many years. I'm delighted to talk about philanthropy in China, evolution, actors, and lessons for a few minutes today. I'll survey a couple of, at least what I regard as key issues in this field, and then I'm pleased to discuss any of this at more length, in more detail, if anyone would like. As the introducers have said, I'm based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the law school. I also work closely with a group called the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, which is based in Washington, ICNL, which works on nonprofit and philanthropic regulation around the world in more than 100 countries. I want to talk about three issues today. Some introductory discussion of aspects of Chinese philanthropy. Then talk briefly about overseas philanthropy in China. Overseas philanthropy in China and some of the issues for overseas philanthropy in China. And then I want to talk third about what we call, at least in Chinese, the going out process, which is Chinese philanthropic and in some cases social organizations heading outside of China to work abroad. And that's some of what you may have seen here in Peru as well. So we start with two sort of fundamental views about the evolution of Chinese philanthropy over the last 40 years. When I arrived in China for the first time, which was during the Cultural Revolution in 1972, there was nothing that we could call a Chinese private philanthropy at that time. But it began to develop relatively rapidly in the 1980s and particularly in the early 1990s and beyond. So we now have thousands of Chinese foundations, as well as many thousands of different kinds of associations, social organizations, grassroots organizations at the local level. And there are, although I'm probably there's more views than two views, there's sort of two approaches to this. One is the idea that I put here from party-state control to party-state control, which in effect posits that despite the growth and diversification of this field in China, its key characteristic is that it remains under party-state firm control in China. And that's why I put it as party-state control, late 80s, early 90s, 1990s, to party-state control today, and arguably it is under even firmer party-state control today in terms of its formation activities, what it's not permitted to do, restrictions, etc., investments, than it was then. The other view, which is not necessarily a contradictory view, is to recognize that the diversification of forms and activities and intentions, and particularly innovation in the Chinese philanthropic and nonprofit world, has been really extraordinarily interesting and impressive to watch over the past, say, 30 years. China is now a leader in terms of developing, for example, digital and online philanthropy. Chinese social organizations and foundations are working on innovative forms of providing social services. These two views are not necessarily in conflict. The innovation and diversification that we see in the Chinese philanthropic world is not in conflict with the fact that Chinese philanthropy and social affairs, social organizations remain under very firm party and state control, but we see these aspects coexisting. We have a variety of actors, as I began to say. On the philanthropic side, we have many thousands of foundations, many of them initially built on corporate and family funding, and those remain some of the most prominent organizations in China on the philanthropic side. We also have a new group of community foundations and other community philanthropy groups, which our Chinese colleagues, colleagues who study this, have paid particular attention to in recent years, and a variety of other philanthropic groups. On the social organizations side, what we might call NGOs or associations, there's a variety of forms as well. Each of these, as I said, is under pretty strict monitoring and control from the Chinese party and the Chinese state, but the forms have diversified. That control takes place in political, security, and legal aspects. Sometimes outside of China, there's some focus on the legal aspects, a charity law dating from 2016 and earlier regulations, and as I'll discuss later, what we call in China an overseas NGO law, which governs the work of overseas groups, foundations, and NGOs working in China. But the legal aspects of this are probably third most important. The political controls and the security controls on this sector are probably more important than the formal legal controls themselves. What does Chinese philanthropy do in this current era? One thing that Chinese philanthropy does, and no one would disagree with this, I don't think, in China, is that Chinese philanthropy is what I'm calling here the loyal partner of the state and the party in providing social services to the Chinese population. that eliminates a wide range of activities, which we might call advocacy, or in many cases, policy-related activities. Advocacy and many forms of policy-related activities are not open to the Chinese philanthropic sector for the most part. The Chinese philanthropic sector has, in effect, been directed by political, security, and legal policy toward providing basic social services, what we in a different era might have called charitable activities for the Chinese population. It can do that in innovative ways, but that's its remit, that's its responsibility in Chinese society. Having said that, I don't want to emphasize only the control side of this. The Chinese philanthropic sector has played a leading role in developing innovative methods for providing social services. Many of those are pilot programs at local levels, but they're noticed. And they're noticed especially by local governments, they're noticed by provincial governments, and sometimes they are permitted or encouraged to expand. For the new group of thousands of Chinese foundations, most of which have formed in the last 20 years or so, the focus is more on operating activities than on grant making. And that has been noticed from the beginning. Most Chinese foundations prefer to fund and run their own activities for the most part. That is not to say there isn't grant making in this process, but in general, we would see less grant making from Chinese foundations than we would from foundations in many parts of the world. That's because the Chinese philanthropic sector, to some degree prefers to run its own programs, health programs, education programs, things like that. To some degree, perhaps doesn't fully trust the NGO or social organization sector in Chinese society, which mostly consists of either government-related groups or small grassroots groups, neither of which the philanthropic community would prefer to work with if it can run its own programs. The result of this complex dynamic is that we are seeing more operating activities than grant-making activities. And this has some implications for the work of Chinese philanthropy abroad, which I will also mention briefly. So this plays out in various ways with the current primary actors in Chinese philanthropy. Corporate and family philanthropy, for the most part, there are of course many exceptions, but for the most part are engaged in operating activities, running their own programs, building schools, building clinics, providing school lunches for kids, a variety of programs. They sometimes do this in partnership with NGOs or other groups. They often do this through direct activities. And it's the corporate and philanthropy side of this sector, of the philanthropic sector, that has grown the most over the past 20 years or so. We also have state-linked, directly state-linked entities. Of course, all of these entities are state-linked, but we have directly state-linked entities like charity associations that also provide some philanthropic activity and may be both recipients of private philanthropy and the providers of philanthropic resources in some cases. Those include charity associations and other directly state-linked entities, some of which have had a mixed reputation in China in recent decades, including scandals and things like that. So sometimes the philanthropic entities, the private philanthropic entities, the first category here, corporate and family philanthropy, is not as willing to work through some of the state-linked charity associations, charity groups, as one might think in a state-controlled society like China. That adds to the impetus, you might say, for corporate and family philanthropy to sometimes want to carry out its own direct operating activities rather than working through grant making. As I mentioned before, we have seen over the past 20 years in a controlled way the development of some community, grassroots, community foundation type philanthropy in China. This began to some degree in the south of China 15 or 20 years ago, with the formation of several community foundations which gather funds from the community and return those funds in philanthropic donations within the community, as well as running their own programs. But it's an interesting aspect of the sector in China because it was virtually unknown in China when the foundation building stage began in the 1990s. And then we have, sort of as an overlay over all of this, including individual giving, we have an enormous rise in the platforms for digital and online giving in China. My colleague, Professor Deng Guosheng from Tsinghua University, some of you may have been in touch with Professor Deng over the years, is an expert in this digital and online giving growth in China. It has become the most important way for Chinese citizens and families other than the very richest families to become parts of this philanthropic and donation process in China. Through a variety of large platforms, some of them tied to major media and other companies. And it's one of the strengths of the Chinese philanthropic community today. Let me say a few words. And again, any of these themes I'm talking about, I'm pleased to talk about in more detail if there's interest. Let me talk for a few minutes about overseas philanthropy in China and then turn to Chinese philanthropy going abroad. We've seen forms of overseas philanthropy in China, obviously going back several hundred years. In the time of the PRC, from 1949 onwards, we saw virtually no private philanthropy in China from 1949 till about the late 1970s with the opening of the reform era in China. At that time, some overseas philanthropic actors began discussions with the Chinese party and government about beginning certain kinds of philanthropic activities in China. Of course, in the Chinese diaspora outside China, there had long been some charitable and philanthropic activities at the individual or the clan or the family level in China. But in terms of philanthropic organizations, foreign foundations, and other groups, this really dates to the late 70s and particularly the early 1980s. So, for example, the Ford Foundation, with which I worked for a number of years, and Professor Sanborn worked for a number of years, began discussions with China in 1982 and 1983. That's toward the beginning of the reform era, but not at the very beginning of the reform era, about whether the Ford Foundation could be helpful to China, particularly in terms of capacity building in the academic and some other realms. That work began from New York in 1983, and then I was fortunate, very lucky, to be able to go to China with Ford in late 1988 when a small group of us opened the Ford Foundation office in Beijing in 2 rooms of a hotel. In late 1988, that office still exists in China. Professor Sanborn and others are in touch with it and continues to make grants in China and outside China for work relating to China. That's one example of a foreign foundation in China. I think it is safe to say, and I think our colleagues at foreign foundations or foreign philanthropic entities who work in China, I think it is safe to say that there was perhaps more flexibility in terms of what could be done in China in those years, the late 80s, the 90s, parts of the early 2000s, more flexibility then than there is now. And in fact, foreign philanthropy in China has gone through a long arc, a 40-year arc, from being careful, what I call here, carefully managed partners of Chinese academic institutions, civil society, the Chinese state, to more peripheral actors in the Chinese philanthropic community. As China has gained resources, as China has become more prosperous over the last 40 years, as Chinese indigenous philanthropy has grown, and as there have been more restrictions imposed on overseas philanthropy from countries outside China, as well as Hong Kong and other places on the periphery of China, we have seen overseas or foreign philanthropy being pushed out to the periphery. It is no longer assuming the kinds of importance that it did, say, in the late 80s and the 1990s. The Hong Kong situation is even more complex. There are Hong Kong philanthropic actors who have been active in China for decades and much longer. There's now wealthy Hong Kong philanthropy, the Jockey Club and others that some of you are aware of, that is becoming more active in China today and trying to figure out, in a complex environment in Hong Kong and a complex environment in the PRC, what makes sense to do philanthropically across the border from Hong Kong. That's a very complicated political and philanthropic set of decisions which some wealthy Hong Kong philanthropists, philanthropic organizations are trying to figure out now. But in general, overseas philanthropy has been pushed to the borders, not the borders of China, but the borders of philanthropic and social activity. The Chinese political actors no longer consider foreign foundations to be in any way central to Chinese development. The funds that they have to spend in China are now dwarfed by the funds that the Chinese state and Chinese philanthropy itself has to devote to activities in China. And Chinese philanthropic organizations, especially those tied to corporates and families, are considered politically far more trustworthy than the foreign actors. At the same time, there are still overseas philanthropic actors still active in China. China is not Russia. China has not pushed the philanthropic community. Thank you very much. China has not pushed the philanthropic community out of China. Instead, what China has done through the overseas NGO law, the formal name in Chinese and English is much longer, but we call it the overseas NGO law. Instead, what China has done is set up clear channels and restrictions for foreign philanthropy to work in China. We have representative offices. I think the word offices, I unintentionally deleted from the slide. And we have project activities, and those are the only two channels under which foreign philanthropy can currently work in China. Ford Foundation has an office, Gates Foundation has an office, a variety of other organizations, not only foundations, but also NGOs have offices in China, and they are able to work on a circumscribed, limited range of activities in China. It is also possible for foreign academic institutions, some NGOs, some foundations, to work in China not through a representative office, but through one-year temporary activities that are approved, of course, by the Chinese government. That monitoring and approval process, which took hold in 2017, when the overseas NGO law came into effect, has had the result of further pushing foreign philanthropy out toward the edges, toward the periphery in Chinese society. I call this more third sector, less civil society, in the sense that China wants foreign philanthropy working on a much more restricted range of activities, almost entirely social services for Chinese populations, having nothing to do with areas such as policy advocacy, legal reform, women's rights, and a variety of other activities that overseas philanthropy might have been engaged with, was engaged with in China in the 1990s and parts of the 2000s. That's the third sector side, social services. They don't want civil society activities by foreign foundations. They don't want the kind of advocacy, legal reform, or other things. And this overseas NGO law, which was adopted in 2016, came into effect in 2017, as some of you know very well, is the primary method by which to restrict the activities of those organizations. So overseas philanthropy in China, foundations, NGOs, and others have responded to this increasing, what I call peripheralization, pushing organizations to the periphery, increasing restriction in China in a couple of different ways. One is by following state policy. They want to remain in China. China's an enormously important country and becoming more important every year. And they're willing to make the compromises to remain in China, which means working on the kinds of social services, education, health, and some other fields that China is willing to have foreign philanthropy work on. That's what I call, perhaps not the best phrase, that's what I call binding more closely to the state. In some cases, organizations, because the range of partnerships with China, the restrictions in China, make partnering with some Chinese institutions, academic institutions, grassroots civil society institutions, makes that more complicated. Some organizations have begun doing some grant making outside China to better understand Chinese developments and the arc of Chinese reform. So we see a number of foundations that have, in effect, returned to some earlier forms of grant making by funding capacity building about China outside China. This is something, for example, that the Ford Foundation was doing to enhance understanding of China in India, in Hong Kong, and other places in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And because there are more restrictions in China on philanthropic activity from outside today, we do see some foreign foundations and others returning to that kind of external capacity building work today. And of course, we see, particularly in US-China relations, but also with some other countries as well, the ebb and flow, the rise and fall of philanthropic relations to some degree based on how bilateral relations are going with China. When, for example, and I'm speaking very generally, when, for example, bilateral relations with China are difficult, it can be more difficult for American organizations to get their project activities approved in China or their representative offices approved in China. When China and the United States, but this is particularly on the Chinese side, are trying to improve relations or calibrate things a little bit more warmly, we sometimes see the process of opening these foreign offices in China or approving these one-year project permits a little bit easier. And we have seen that ebb and flow, that calibration over the past several years. And then finally, as a third theme, and I will have talked too long by then, finally, as a third theme, the idea of going out, which is the Chinese term for not only philanthropic and civil society actors, but also business and other actors, moving outside China for activities with the rest of the world. I call this China as a philanthropic and civil society actor beyond its borders. I'm going to talk primarily about the philanthropic side of that, but I have a special interest, as Cynthia and others know, in China as a civil society actor beyond its borders. But most of what's happening is in the philanthropic community. And most of what's happening in terms of Chinese philanthropy moving abroad has to do with the nations on the periphery of China, which of course are very important to China. Laos, Cambodia, Nepal, Bhutan, and other places, Central Asia, on the periphery of China. Sometimes we see more philanthropic development there than we see on places, in places further from China. And we see a diverse and rapidly developing set of forms of that going out in philanthropy, some of which may be recognizable here. The most important is the beginning of philanthropic activity by Chinese corporate entities that have gone abroad, either in a trading set of relationships or in an investment set of relationships. And we see that when Chinese corporates move abroad, this is not specific to China, we see this with many corporates from many nations. When Chinese corporates move abroad, there has often been, at the very initial stages today, some kind of philanthropic or social element to that work. That can take many forms. It can take the forms of direct cash donations to social projects in the vicinities of corporate activities in various countries around the world. It can take strategic forms in terms of investing in local communities beyond the charitable. Beyond the corporate side, which I think in most countries has been the most important form of Chinese philanthropy going out so far, we also see some large Chinese foundations beginning to explore operating or grant-making activities beyond the Chinese border. they sometimes hope to do this in conjunction with large domestic social organizations in China. I'll give one or two examples. There's a Chinese group called the Chinese Fund for Poverty Alleviation, which has played an important role in China and which has begun to work outside of China on poverty alleviation matters. Sometimes Chinese foundations prefer to work through Chinese organizations as they go abroad. And we've seen this in a number of different countries. We also see third, a really interesting, and a Chinese colleague, Professor Zhu Jiangang, has written about this. We see a really interesting process of what is sometimes called in China a recirculation or reglobalization, which is international NGOs that have worked in China, in some cases for many decades, developing local Chinese branches, which are organized in China and which are governed themselves in China, doing charitable and philanthropic and social work in China, and those Chinese organizations then deciding to go abroad, finding funding from within China, maybe sometimes from outside China, and taking the skills that they've learned in China through the process of localizing in China and taking those abroad. Let me give you one example which Professor Zhu, who's an old colleague and friend, has recently written about. There's a large foreign, I think originally American, but I'm not sure, NGO called Heifer International, heifer as in cows, which has been active in China for many years, and which developed, or had out of it developed, a local Chinese NGO, which in Chinese is called Haihui. That local Chinese NGO, presumably well-funded, but I don't know anything about their funding myself, then decided to work abroad, and through some interesting process, which Professor Zhu has written about, decided to work in Thailand, which is a country on the borders, on the periphery of China, and so it's not surprising that as Chinese organizations decide to go out, they would sometimes start with a place relatively close to China. Not always, but sometimes. That international organization that developed into a local NGO, a local organization in China, then decided to go out and has become active in Thailand. It's become active in Thailand in a really interesting way. It's become active in Thailand by funding social activities that are related to the Thai state and particularly the Thai military. This is something that I think I can safely say that many American or other NGOs would probably think very, very carefully before they did, working directly with the Thai military, for example. But this organization coming from China has decided to support some of the social activities connected to the Thai military, and this has been written up as a case study in China. That's an example of that recirculation. International NGOs, in effect, hiving off a local NGO or a local association in China. That local association in China continues to do very good work in China and at the same time decides to go abroad with the full permission of the Chinese state. And then having found funding in China or elsewhere, then does social activities, social support outside China. Of particular interest to me, because I come from a law base, is the idea of China as what I call here a quasi-regulatory actor. Whether in certain industries, China is supporting the development of philanthropic and nonprofit law abroad, the way American and other organizations have done for a very long time. Whether China in some cases, in some industries, may be supporting the development of dispute resolution mechanisms or other mechanisms that are related to investment and trade abroad. We're only beginning to see this over the past several years, but it's an aspect of, again, what we call in China, in Chinese, going out. So those are three themes. evolution and some primary themes in terms of the development of Chinese philanthropy over many decades, but particularly in the 1990s and the 2000s. In the 1990s, Chinese philanthropy and Chinese social organizations had much more flexibility than they do today. The questions involving overseas philanthropy in China, which again have followed a similar arc over 40 years. Somewhat more flexibility in the late 80s, the 1990s, and the 2000s today, and many more restrictions today compared to the past. And the newest area, which is Chinese philanthropy going abroad, in which we see the very initial development of forms of philanthropy that I indicate here. That's not a complete list, but there'll be much more research to be done on this in the years ahead, because this process of going out by Chinese philanthropic actors or Chinese NGOs with funding is barely 10 years old at this point. And so it's really just at its initial stages. So with those three themes, I'm going to stop talking and see what kinds of questions or issues you would like to raise. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Mark, for your very insightful remarks. Following our agenda, we will have some comments from Professor Matthew Bird. Professor Matthew Bird is Associate Professor in the Department of Management at the Graduate School at Universidad del Pacífico, and also a member of the Research Center. Dear Matthew, please.
Yeah, okay, listo. ¿Todos me escuchan bien? Yeah, okay, listo. Fantastico. Mark, I'm going to deliver these comments in Spanish, considering probably the most natural language for the audience. Okay, great. Y con la edad no veo ni de lejos ni de cerca, así que voy a sacar los lentes. Y bueno, quiero agradecer a los comentarios de la charla de Mark, porque al escucharlo, igual que como durante nuestra conversación ayer, me explotó la cabeza. Porque uno ve con ese microcosmo, pero con el caso de filantropía china, también muchas tendencias, coyunturas históricas globales que están en juego. Pero también vemos, y como hemos mencionado, yo estudio tomando hilo de Felipe y Cynthia, el estudio de la filantropía en América Latina. Y veo, y estoy como entre dos cosas. No sé si estamos hablando de un espejo, un modelo del futuro, y no voy a juzgar si es un modelo bueno o malo, sino como formación de modelos de filantropía en esa nueva coyuntura histórica donde estamos entrando. Entonces voy pensando en, me ayuda Cynthia con los tiempos acá, algunas reflexiones, algunas en base de nuestra conversación ayer, pero conectado con tus puntos hoy, pero también habían como unas nuevas ideas que han salido. Lo primero es, yo creo que es interesante partir de, volviendo a Aristóteles, que Gustavo mencionó, es a través de la comparación que se construye conocimiento. Y por eso es tan interesante el caso que ha presentado Mark y pensando también en Misión Jesuita y el caso filantrópico aquí en Perú y en América Latina. Y es a través de eso que construimos conocimiento. China y América Latina, y en el caso específico Perú, se ven muy diferentes, ¿no? En términos del rol de gobierno, institucionales débiles o fuertes, la historia de la sociedad civil, etc. Pero ambas enfrentan la misma pregunta central, yo creo. ¿Qué papel debe jugar la filantropía privada en sociedades marcadas por, y podemos decirlo en los dos casos, desigualdad y grados de confianza, desconfianza en el Estado? Y también pensando en qué es la filantropía y tipo de filantropía que se manifiesta, depende de dos cosas, ¿no? Por un lado, y hablamos de esto ayer, Mark, el rol del Estado en la provisión de bienes públicos, porque la filantropía en cierto sentido es la segunda mejor opción en términos de llenar vacíos, en términos de provisión de bienes públicos. Y a veces esos espacios para la filantropía, sociedad civil, están abiertos de manera muy intencional por el Estado, pero también por defecto, ¿no? Sin querer se abren esos espacios. Y es interesante, hasta vienen espacios intencionados o no dentro de China que se abrió y también lo mismo pasa creo, en Perú. Entonces, también nos preguntamos qué tipo de relación entre Estado, filantropía y sociedad estamos construyendo cuando llenamos estos vacíos. Y quiero que piensen también lo que está pasando hoy en día es en las últimas décadas yo creo que es más. También se puede marcar filantropía en Estados Unidos hasta ahora. Ha dado un giro también a partir de los años 80, porque la filantropía durante el welfare state, ¿no? Que también había una especie en Estados Unidos de posguerra, su rol es diferente comparado con la filantropía, podemos decir, desde los años 90 hasta ahora. Y yo creo que estamos entrando en una nueva fase de filantropía y que se está reconfigurando. Ahora, pensando en eso, respondiendo a lo que mencionó Mark con respecto a China, me hace pensar, ¿no? En términos de China, tenemos un Estado fuerte, centralizado, regulación densa, el charity law, ley, ONGs, etc. Y es interesante porque el Estado siempre tenemos que pensar a los dos lados. No solo es controlador, pero justamente en controlar habilita ciertos espacios, ¿no? de acción a la vez. Fuerte supervisión. En América Latina, históricamente, ¿qué tenemos en comparación? Regulación débil, fragmentada y poco aplicada. Vacíos regulatorios, ¿no? Grandes, incentivos tributarios muy inconsistentes y un Estado muy ausente en la parte habilitadora. Entonces, por un lado, vemos en China riesgos de demasiado control, ¿no? Pero en América Latina vemos riesgos al otro lado, ¿no? Muy poca regulación, regulación muy impredecible, etc. Entonces, la pregunta mirando a China para Perú, yo diría, es ¿cómo diseñamos una regulación que construya confianza, rendición de cuentas, sin, y esa es la lección de China también, asfixiar la iniciativa cívica? Entonces, como mirando China como espejo ahí. También, ¿quién da y cuán independiente es? ¿No? Y también la tendencia hacia la integración vertical, que yo veo lo mismo en América Latina que en China, por las razones, en cierto sentido, parecidas. Entonces, en China tenemos lo que mucha más filantropía cooperativa, de familia, etcétera, ciertas élites, vínculos fuertes con partido de Estado, ¿no? Según tengo entendido por espacios, me corriges. Pero lo fascinante fue lo que mencionaste de la innovación. Limitaron el espacio de operación, ¿no? Pero sí, en cierto sentido, dieron parámetros para innovar en cómo brindar mejor esos servicios sociales en esas áreas, ¿no? Es interesante considerarlo porque en cierto sentido es limitante, pero también dicen que la buena estrategia es lo que se puede hacer y no se puede hacer, tener muy claro lo que no se debe hacer. No estoy diciendo que hacen un juicio bueno o malo, pero en cierto sentido, por defecto, quizás hay como más enfoque en términos de ciertas acciones. En América Latina tenemos grandes donantes, grupos empresariales familiares, fundaciones cooperativas, muy parecidos en ese sentido porque son lo más grandes en la región, aunque yo diría que también en términos de comparación que lo que ellos están donando comparado con lo que gasta el Estado, igual tenemos una desigualdad muy grande, pero también tenemos esta tendencia, especialmente de cooperativa familiar, hacia la responsabilidad social, ¿no? Cooperativa. Mucho más siempre pensando, menos en la filantropía estratégica institucional pura cuando hablamos de Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, etcétera, las grandes filantropías, Gates en Estados Unidos. Casi siempre está como un filantropocapitalismo. en ese sentido. Entonces, la pregunta que tengo aquí es, en ambos sistemas dominan actores económicos, ¿no? Pero bajo condiciones se vuelve como una filantropía muy reputacional, ¿no? Y me pregunto, no lo vi aquí, si también la filantropía en China tiene un aspecto de performance reputacional. No lo escuché en tus comentarios, pero sí también hay un elemento ahí, porque eso sí se ve en América Latina. Y por el otro lado, veo cómo se puede, aprendiendo de China, cómo se puede canalizar mejor los pocos recursos filantrópicos en áreas como en China, por bien o por mal, donde como está como brindando servicios, no bienes públicos, cómo se puede como con tan pocos recursos canalizarlos mejor. Finalmente, ecosistemas. China es interesante, un sector fundacional muy grande, como mencionas, y muy restrictivo, mucho monitoreo, etc. Y lo fascinante es, y voy a hablar de la ley llamada anti-ONG aquí en Perú, pero en América Latina tenemos como lo opuesto históricamente, ¿no? Infraestructura muy débil, pocos datos, por eso buscamos posicionarnos, redes fragmentadas. Hay cierta división de trabajo entre filantropía local, en términos de hay mucho más enfoque en educación, salud de la filantropía local, y la cooperación internacional busca llenar vacíos, pero ciertos tipos de vacíos, medio ambiente, derechos indígenas, también y el tema migrante hasta, ¿no? De desplazamiento venezolano. Es mucho más de apoyo de cooperación internacional que local. Entonces, en Perú, América Latina, hay más libertad sobre el papel, menos ecosistema, pero no hay datos, no estamos como operando en el vacío, y también hay mucha desconfianza, y sería muy interesante comparar por qué es que hay integración, donan y operan, ellos no donan, no hay mucho grant making, ¿no? Pero creo que tiene que ver con ese ecosistema de falta de desconfianza, de control sobre sus propios recursos, etc. Y también sobre el cierto temor que tiene fundaciones familiares y cooperativas con ONGs que creen que tienen como otras líneas políticas posiblemente, y hay ciertos riesgos reputacionales. Ahora, todo eso digo porque por un lado vemos, Perú, América Latina, o por lo menos Perú, porque podemos comparar México, Brasil, muy diferente comparado con China. Pero volviendo a lo que dije al principio, me pregunto, ¿qué está pasando con la filantropía mundial en el futuro? Porque si miramos el modelo chino, ¿no? Llamándolo un tipo de modelo, en términos de que se están achicando espacios, no hay espacio cívico, no hay advocacy, ¿no? Muy restrictivo y controlado y canalizado. Y mira lo que estamos pasando ahora con la ley anti-ONG, podría decir un nombre, pero yo voy a llamarlo anti-ONG, porque eso es lo que es. Y regulando especialmente las ONGs internacionales. Y por eso es muy interesante el caso que tú mencionaste, de Overseas Philanthropy. Y en cierto sentido, por otros motivos quizás, se está asemejando, ¿no? Pareciendo, en cierto sentido, Perú a China, en este caso. La nueva ley APSI, ¿no? Registro obligatorio, aprobación previa de proyectos de cooperación. Proyectos deben alinearse con desarrollo nacional, no sé cuál es el desarrollo nacional peruano, pero definido por Estado. Usar fondos de cooperación para apoyar demandas, no se puede usar fondos para apoyar demandas contra el Estado, es una falta grande, hasta 500 UIT creo, que cierra cualquier ustedes deberían saber, la Misión Jesuita, ¿no? Sanciones muy fuertes, y acaba de entrar en vigencia. Y todavía vivimos en una sociedad liberal donde se puede decir algunas cosas, y yo creo que puedes mirar la prensa, había intereses detrás, ¿no? Había intereses detrás. Y intereses detrás que estaban lobbying el mismo Congreso, donde está la división entre grupos o organizaciones criminales y el mismo Congreso. Yo creo que no estoy diciendo nada controvertido aquí, con ustedes y nosotros que vivimos en Perú. Pero ¿por qué están enfocándose en derechos indígenas, en medio ambiente? ¿Dónde están las economías ilícitas en ese país? ¿No? Están la Amazonía en los Andes, minería ilegal, desforestación, etc. ¿Por qué se enfocan ahí? Porque mientras la filantropía peruana se enfoca en salud y educación, en su propio espacio, es justamente la filantropía internacional que aboga mucho más por el medio ambiente, derechos indígenas, etc. Entonces, todo eso lo digo como un aviso, un warning, pero también quiero ser abierto qué podemos aprender, ¿no?, del caso chino, porque yo veo espacios cívicos achicándose que hay en Perú, y en ese sentido es muy interesante, porque sí hay un espacio cívico en Perú, pero estamos justamente en ese límite, entre esa transición, y honestamente yo no sé a dónde va, ¿no? Y sería interesante, no sé, a través de la comparación que tenemos en conocimiento, seguir pensando en qué aprendemos del caso chino, ¿no? También ni siquiera he tocado la presencia china en Perú, que ese es otro tema, pero ¿qué podemos aprender con esas comparaciones para realmente, yo creo que velar por una mejor filantropía? Y yo sí voy a decir, porque sí tiene un rol en espacio cívico, pero con esas tendencias se van achicando, no solo en China, sino en América Latina y, hay que decirlo, en Estados Unidos también. Así que sería muy interesante seguir conversando sobre esos temas. Gracias, Mark.
Muchas gracias, Matthew. Bueno, antes de comenzar con las preguntas y respuestas, maybe I would like to, open the floor for Mark to comment on Matthew's insights as well.
Thank you. Matthew, thank you. Very useful, very detailed comments. On a couple things to start. We're seeing around the world, not just the Chinese case, the Chinese authoritarian case, but we're seeing two sets of restrictions on philanthropy and civil society, which come out in the Chinese case in some ways, and come out in your comments as well. First, we're seeing the raising of barriers to cross-border activity. That's cross-border activity into China, and it's a variety of raising of barriers from within countries, from outside countries, to philanthropy and civil society moving among countries, usually to carry out the kinds of advocacy or other kinds of work that you were identifying. That's one set of barriers. The other set of barriers, which you were also mentioning, and which certainly apply to Chinese philanthropy and civil society in China, are domestic barriers, domestic restrictions, what we sometimes call, we don't call it this in China, but what we sometimes call the closing of civic space. That's a term we use worldwide. That's a term you were using. And those two barriers are presenting a difficult time for foundations, civil society organizations, and others in many countries around the world. It can be tempting to call that an authoritarian problem, a problem of China, a problem of Hungary, a problem of Russia, but it's not. And as you were saying toward the end of your remarks, we're seeing some of this these days in the United States as well. We're seeing the introduction of hoped-for restrictions in the United States on certain kinds of philanthropic and civil society activities. We're seeing threats of investigations. We're seeing threats of taking away the tax exemption from a variety of American foundations and other civil society, 501c3 nonprofit groups. Those barriers, those restrictions are rising in the United States. At the same time, there are clearly some in the United States that would like to restrict the outbound flow of philanthropic investment. At the same time, as a place like China, while slowly and very deliberately, is increasing the outbound flow of its philanthropic and nonprofit activities. But we're seeing something of the reverse in the United States. So, for example, just to cite a brief example, in April and May, it appeared that the new or renewed Trump administration in the United States might be preparing to issue an executive order that would formally restrict, in some ways, outbound flows of philanthropic investments from the United States abroad by American foundations or other groups. This could have been done on a country-by-country basis. No more giving to China, no more giving to some other countries. It could have been attempted on certain kinds of issues like climate change or the environment or indigenous rights or human rights. It wasn't clear what was planned, and that was put off, but it remains something of a threat in the United States that we will see the raising of those fences, the raising of those barriers toward outbound philanthropic investment as well. While inbound philanthropic investment into the United States is, in terms of dollar value, not a huge amount, it has sometimes been really interesting to watch in the disaster context or in certain contexts involving relationships between human rights groups and others outside the United States and inside the United States. And we now have state legislation in the United States, especially in some of the southern states, that could well restrict inbound philanthropic investment as well. That is less important in the US than the outbound philanthropic investment, but still also really interesting to watch. I'm going to stop there. Matthew, thank you very much.
Okay, so now we'll move to the questions. We got like a lot of questions for both of our speakers. Well, for Mark, like, do you know if there's any philanthropic foundations, Chinese philanthropic foundations in Latin America? Also, do you think that China will follow the philanthropic model of the US and Europe? And do you think that philanthropy in China will be moved by the same causes that are also interested in the philanthropic sector in US and Europe?
So a couple of brief comments on that. We're really at the very initial stages in terms of Chinese foundations and other philanthropic entities beginning to move abroad. We're seeing some cases of this, and again, more closer to China than further away from China, but we're at the very beginning stages. So the first question for me is the question of data. The information we have on this in terms of Chinese philanthropy moving abroad is fragmented, episodic data. And we need a better way of aggregating that data to figure out what Chinese philanthropy is doing abroad. There's different ways of doing that, but it's an initial problem. I don't see Chinese philanthropy moving abroad, whether it's to Latin America or elsewhere, in the same ways that we saw American philanthropy moving abroad. American philanthropy moving abroad to Europe, to Latin America, to Africa, to Asia, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, may have reflected American or US values, but it did not come at the express direction of the state, the express control of the state, the government, in the same way that Chinese philanthropy is. Chinese philanthropy going abroad is going to be, already is, closely aligned with Chinese government policy. Probably, I would argue, more closely aligned with Chinese party and government policy than much of American philanthropy was 40 or 50 years ago. That means that Chinese foundations, in thinking about activities abroad, or Chinese companies thinking about corporate social responsibility, corporate giving, activity abroad, are going to be aligning with ministries in Beijing. That means that they are going to be closely in touch with Chinese embassies abroad. They're not going to, especially in the early stages, they're not going to want to engage in philanthropic activities abroad that we would say show any daylight between their activities and Chinese government policy. That doesn't mean that they are purely the arm of the Chinese party and state, but I think we will see very close alignment with party and state, especially state goals abroad. How that plays out in the early stages versus 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is hard to tell. But in terms of alignment with policy actors in Beijing, that's the ministries for the most part. It's also party bodies, but it's primarily ministries for this. And alignment with the Chinese embassies abroad, I think you're going to see a lot of consultation.
Okay, following that question, there's another one who said like taking consideration importance of China investment in Latin America. Do you think there is any strategy from the state-owned enterprises that through CSR they can influence some sort of like philanthropic activities in the countries in which China invests?
You know, at this relatively early stage, first 10 years, for example, there's a lot we don't know. To what degree are Chinese state-owned enterprises, or for that matter, private enterprises, aligning with each other as they think about CSR activities abroad, not only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world? We don't have a good idea about that. Chinese scholars are also interested in that issue. They're very interested in the issue of Chinese philanthropy, including corporate philanthropy, going abroad. One of the reasons they're interested in that issue is because maybe in some cases they might have a bit more autonomy, a bit more freedom to research those issues than they would perhaps some sensitive issues in China itself. But they are also interested in the questions of alignment. To what degree are Chinese corporates talking with each other about their social activities? For example, when they're in the same industry, such as mining or other activities. I have to say we don't have good information on that yet. And I think we'll need to rely on Chinese scholars to do the kinds of interviewing in Beijing, Shanghai, and elsewhere in China to try to figure out what that alignment looks like. Alignment with each other, alignment with the Chinese state in terms of talking with ministries, alignment with the Chinese foreign ministry, meaning with the embassies abroad. So, I mean, it's to some degree a data question, an information question. Traditionally, Chinese philanthropy, when I say traditionally, again, I mean the last 10 or 15 years, Chinese philanthropy going abroad has not aligned or had many conversations with domestic philanthropy. They don't tend to attend domestic philanthropy meetings. They don't tend to come to academic activities like this. They tend to be a sector somewhat separate from what's going on within the countries themselves. Again, I don't know if that's how it's playing out in Peru, but I think that's what we see in a number of other places closer to China. I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
It's really interesting. In both of those last two responses by Mark, I think there was kind of a similar model, if you will, that was emerging there. And it seems to be, and it came out in your talk too, it seems to be there is a very, when it comes to China abroad, I think even the Belt and Road Initiative, I think kind of why people say, will China, replace the deficit now in kind of development humanitarian aid and what have you, but it's very restrained, right? And it's very focused on particular interests. It's like what you were saying in terms of the periphery. It's about security, or if it's in Africa or South America, it's about resources, right? And it seems to be almost, I don't know if the question is how aligned is it in terms of discipline, but it seems to be kind of a very narrow lane and not going out of that lane. And it sounds like maybe it's respect for sovereignty issues or what have you, but it's definitely an approach. I don't know what to call it a strategy, but it's an approach. And I just want to jump on top of what you're saying, because I think what we're seeing here, in many ways, I think China is almost a global leader, leading indicator of where things are going. Because if you look to, sorry to keep bringing back in the US here, but if you look to, what was, you were mentioning kind of Ford and others in the 50s, and, it was, let's not be naive. There were national interests, right? It was within the Cold War, and there was values, and it was about democracy, and it was about markets and what have you that aligned with the national interests. But then in 1990, it was much more philanthropy about principles, rules-based order. So the question is, what does philanthropy look like? Because we're moving out of a liberal rules-based order. Let's be honest. That's what's happening right now. And the model that you just explained for China looks very similar if you read, for example, the US State Department about how they're reconsidering development aid. It's all about our interests. It's very transactional, right? It's about what serves us, whether it's security or resources or our national interests. And in a sense, I'm curious, it's hard to interject here. I'm curious, do you see the same pattern as I'm seeing and maybe others are seeing it? Is this a new model? And so philanthropy operating within that being framed, or do we need to, as you're saying, continue to fight for that civic space? Because in this new model, it's about philanthropy, about delivering interest in its lane, social services, what have you, but it's not about advocacy, it's not about rights, it's not about principles.
It is restrained, it's restricted, it's very careful. One of the questions in the past 9-10 months has been, will China try to step in and take up some of the gap, and in effect try to substitute for the United States in some soft power ways as U.S. foreign aid, the demise of USAID, et cetera, as that persists. We're seeing almost none of that so far. Now, it's very early. Chinese policy does not turn quickly. We're not going to see sort of emergency or rapid actions like this in China. But I think on the philanthropic side, what we're seeing is restrained and careful, attuned to the interests of philanthropists, largely corporations or corporate families going abroad, and very much attuned to national interests, which results in the kind of consultations, whether it's with ministries in Beijing or with embassies abroad. The irony for those of us who have watched the Chinese Foreign Ministry or Chinese embassies abroad for many years is that as a more diverse range of Chinese actors goes abroad, companies, universities, and others, the Chinese embassies abroad as bridges and points of contact and as ways of being in touch for Chinese entities so that they do not inadvertently cross Chinese policy or in any way contradict Chinese policy, the embassies have become more and more important over the last 10 or 15 years. And they are aware, the Chinese Foreign Ministry is very aware that they are now the primary bridge, the primary point of contact for a much wider range of Chinese entities going abroad. Very different from the 1990s or the 1980s, for example. So I do see it as restrained. I see it as careful. I see it as largely focusing on charity and social services in the areas in which parent organizations, companies, families have their manufacturing, investment, mining, or other relationships. I have to say, I don't see a lot of support for infrastructure organizations in the civil society or philanthropic field. I may be wrong, but I don't see a lot of support so far for academic institutions or for academic capacity building. The exception, I think, could be, in some cases, in the business and economics area or in the understanding of China itself. Those are two areas in which Chinese philanthropy, especially the corporate side, could see some self-interest or some mutual interests. Again, business economics or China studies. But I think initially it's quite restrained.
But I have to come back to the main point, which is that what we know is really fragmented about this. We see reports about Chinese philanthropic or social investment on the border with Laos when USAID pulled out. We see, scattered things in Africa, in Latin America. We talk to Ford or others, Gates, who hear about things. There is a large Chinese foreign aid mechanism. To what degree are the philanthropic entities coordinating or aligning with the Chinese foreign aid mechanism, which is a governmental foreign aid mechanism? That's a research question. We really don't have good information about that at all. So there's a tremendous amount we don't know.
I think following that also there is this question about the future, right? So for instance, this question is for both of you. How do you think will be the future of philanthropy, let's say in China, Latin America, or Peru, like by 2035?
So I'm only going to address that issue in China. Then I'm going to turn over to Matthew and others to address Latin America and Peru. Right now, I see the future of philanthropy in China as growth, but under, and again, I'm repeating a theme, under pretty strict control. I don't see a natural evolution toward philanthropy working on advocacy. I don't see a natural evolution in China to philanthropy working on rights, to working on opening civic space, to working on indigenous rights, issues like that. I think it's going to have a charitable social services focus for the foreseeable future. I could be completely wrong about that. We could see political change in China that opens things up and that opens things up for Chinese philanthropy. Believe me, there are people in the Chinese philanthropic world who would like to see more open civic space that allow them to work on grassroots rights issues, for example. Not necessarily called human rights in China, but on advocacy, policy advocacy, environmental, climate change, in a less controlled way. Certainly, there are philanthropic groups that would like to do that. I don't happen to see that in the near to medium future. So I think we're going to continue to see growth, but it's growth with controls. And I'll turn it over to Matthew for the harder questions.
I've come to learn that never try to predict the future in any way. Just speak in terms of what are the tendencies or patterns that you see. It's hard to say 2035. It's like what you're saying in terms of, maybe there'll be kind of a push to open up in China, what have you. I definitely think there's kind of a certain, this is election season in Latin America, right? This year and next year. And there definitely seems to be some sort of tendency towards more a rightward move. There's definitely something you always have to take into account, the relationships with the United States and what's happening. But I think I do see a tendency, I think of beating a dead horse here, towards the space for philanthropy, at least international, overseas. And this also goes for overseas development assistance, kind of reducing. It's already a tendency that's already happened in Latin America. I think that creates a space, to be quite honest, in Peru, you could go country to country. It's maybe a little stronger in some countries, but the culture of philanthropy, of institutional philanthropy, local philanthropy, because there is wealth, just is not there. The capacity just is not there. Doesn't mean it can't get there, but it's going to require a lot of will and leadership and concerted effort. But I do want to say one thing. I think I'll speak for Latin America. There's been a tendency towards the past 20, 25 years of overseas development assistance being pulled out. There's kind of like, if you look at what's happened with USAID and European development assistance also being pulled out in Latin America, Peru, Colombia, for different reasons in the past couple of years, I do think that there's a space in Latin America, that void, that absolutely fundamentally must be filled by local philanthropists. And again, the wealth is there. The wealth is there. But the one thing I will say is it's going to be need to search for a new model because they're still kind of running on fumes of a model of there's overseas development assistance in Latin America, and then the other kind of philanthropists kind of it's almost like it creates a Keynesian effect in the ecosystem, and then the other kind of local actors and NGOs kind of mount on top of it. But it's going to require better rules of the game, incentives, capacity building. The wealth is there. It's going to require all those other pieces. And it's not going to say where it's going to be, but where I would like to see it be is I want to see indigenous, native, Latin America, local philanthropic leadership. And not corporate citizenship, not corporate responsibility, true local institutional philanthropy in the region. Can I ask, I'm curious, we have philanthropists here, the Jesuitas. I'm curious what you see. You're on the ground, you're closer than we are. No sé si quiere hablar en español o inglés o... Disculpe, soy profesora, así que tengo que...
Me parece muy interesante el tema. Nosotros, como Misión Jesuita, tenemos 48 obras a nivel nacional y estamos siempre dispuestos, buscando recursos, digamos, para financiar todas estas obras, tanto en el campo social como en el campo educativo, como en el campo pastoral, ¿verdad? Entonces, sería muy importante si China pudiera ser uno de los proveedores, digamos, de donaciones para estas obras jesuitas que nosotros llevamos a cabo desde muchos años atrás, con una población muy vulnerable. Estamos hablando de comunidades indígenas, migrantes, niños, adultos mayores, familias en situación de pobreza grave, ¿no? Entonces, ojalá podamos encontrar un camino para conseguir recursos de China y poder seguir adelante con nuestra misión jesuita.
Sí, bueno, de mi parte tal vez hacer eco de algo que han mencionado ambos, y es el tema de la restricción de las donaciones, que es creciente esta restricción. Y así como se ve el futuro de la filantropía china como más restrictiva, lo mismo creo voy viendo en otras partes del mundo, inclusive Estados Unidos, ¿no? También hay ahí una restricción mayor a la que había antes. Y las restricciones muchas veces se deben a cuestiones sí, ideológicas, pero también a cuestiones de limitación de fondos. Normalmente las agencias que nos donaban hoy tienen menos recursos para donar. Entonces tienen que restringir aún más, ¿no? Entonces, ese es el gran reto que nosotros enfrentamos porque muchas de nuestras causas sí, digamos, despiertan interés por parte de los cooperantes con los que trabajamos, pero hay otras causas que no necesariamente, ¿no? Por ejemplo, este tema de defensa de la población indígena en el Perú es difícil conseguir fondos incluso dentro de Perú, porque es el mismo Estado quien por esta ley, como has denominado, de anti-ONGs, como se viene mencionando, efectivamente no permiten conseguir fondos para acompañar a personas que quieran defender sus derechos frente al Estado, ¿no? Lo conciben como un despropósito, ¿no? Y en ese sentido te restringen los recursos posibles para eso, ¿no? No porque no te los den, porque nunca te los dieron, sino porque si te los dan, bueno, te persiguen, ¿no? Te hacen mayores problemas. Entonces, claro, esa es una situación compleja. Yo de todas maneras quisiera tener una lectura esperanzadora del futuro en el ámbito filantrópico y también algo lo decían ustedes, ¿no? Cuando hablaban de la filantropía individual, de las personas y local. O sea, creo que es muy importante trabajar en la formación de una ciudadanía global y solidaria para que las personas de a pie en el Perú, que también muchas de ellas van logrando riqueza, puedan ser conscientes de muchas necesidades, desafíos, problemáticas que conviene y que deben contribuir para lograr un mejor país para ellos mismos y para todos. Entonces, en eso seguimos caminando. Gracias.
Thank you. We'll probably take a couple of more questions. So following this like trend of like citizenship, like donations and responsibility. This is for Mark. Like, could you give a more detailed example of digital online giving forms in China?
Yeah, it's an online and digital giving forms in China. Uh, it's a extremely rapidly developing field. Some of it, of course, relates to weaknesses, the weakness of the Chinese banking system, and things like that, and the need to develop ways of charitable giving that go outside traditional financial transactions, traditional financial arrangements. And so, what you've seen, and for people who are interested in this, I can point you to research that Chinese colleagues are doing on online digital philanthropy, an important set of innovations in China, but also a research topic in China that is permissible, that is encouraged, because it's something that the Chinese philanthropic world and the Chinese authorities are proud of. So what we see is a development of a number between 5 and 10 of large platform giving operations. And those are operations that, for those of you who've been in China, are in many cases closely tied to what began as the communications mechanisms, WeChat and other mechanisms, that have developed into comprehensive platforms for financial transactions in everyday life. Taxi rides, banking transactions, restaurants, purchases online and in stores. In China, as I think many of you know, much of this is now done entirely from phones. And what's happened in the charitable and online giving space is that platforms have been added to those mega platforms that enable Chinese citizens to give, often in small amounts, but those amounts add up over time, very efficiently, either for fields or to intermediate companies that then channel donations out to causes, individual, not organizations, or directly to specific organizations. Because of the tie to the mega platforms, WeChat, Alibaba, and others, these have grown very rapidly over the past 10 years. It's not, I think our Chinese colleagues would agree, it's not a pure technological innovation. It's more building on the fact that these platforms have become such a central part of Chinese life. And it's all happened very quickly. You know, when I went back to China for the first time after COVID, which was about a year and a half after COVID, and I had been in China right before COVID in 2019, I spent my first couple hours in Beijing making sure that these platforms were loaded on my phone. Everyone who's been to China in the past several years and who had gone to China before COVID, that's how rapid the change has been, has had to make sure that these platforms were loaded on their phones. Not so much for charitable giving. I haven't tried that in China, but in order to get around, in order to pay for things. So it's very rapid, and it's built, for the most part, on top of these mega platforms, which are now central to Chinese life. For those who are interested, I can point you to the research that our Chinese colleagues are doing about this.
Bueno, un poco para comentar también ese tema, porque yo enseño aquí en la universidad también un curso relacionado a economía digital china y demás, ¿no? Hay un caso de éxito muy interesante que es el Tencent Charity Day. Bueno, Tencent es esta empresa, digamos, una de las más grandes empresas de Internet y de innovación en el Asia, ¿no? Es la dueña de WeChat. Entonces ellos tienen una campaña cada 9 de septiembre, el 9 del 9, ¿no? En donde a través de su plataforma generan todos un espacio digamos, de donaciones para proyectos sociales específicos, ¿no? O sea, todos los años uno puede encontrar más de 10.000 proyectos sociales desde, digamos, pobreza, educación, diversas temáticas, y los usuarios pueden donar directamente, digamos, a través de la plataforma, ¿no? Es una plataforma súper transparente, digamos, al finalizar, digamos, todo el periodo de donación se genera un reporte, ¿no? Para el tema de cuáles fueron los usos de los recursos. Entonces, es un modelo muy interesante e inclusive año tras año ha ido evolucionando y en la actualidad no solo es un día, sino es semanas, ¿no? Y ha ido creciendo también a nivel internacional, ¿no? No solo en Asia, sino también con algunos ejemplos de proyectos en el África, ¿no? Okay, so we have one last question maybe, but this is more like a philosophical question maybe for Mark and Matthew. Like, do you think there is real or an authentic philanthropy, or it's more like a branding strategy for companies?
Yes. I think it's both. It's certainly marketing. It's certainly, especially with Chinese companies moving overseas, which we see from many other countries as well, it's certainly a way of engaging in marketing and good public relations and relations with local actors, whether it's on the ground or with subnational or national actors. That side is clear. But I think it's also an interest in philanthropy. I think China wants to be a philanthropic leader, not just a marketing and public relations leader. So that's why I say yes, by which I mean I think it's both. Maybe sometimes on the corporate side, it's a bit more of the second than the first. But I wouldn't discount the first. The idea of philanthropy and charity is a very powerful idea in China, as any of you who've been to China know. It's a powerful idea in every country, but it's also a powerful idea in China. So I think it's both, and I think understanding that it's both can make it easier to work with. One or two other things, because in case we're finishing, the Chinese academic world is a really useful bridge to Chinese philanthropy. In this era of, really very cold relations between the United States and China, it's the academic world in China that is really the only current bridge that we really have to the Chinese philanthropic world. But that points to the fact that the Chinese academic world, especially people who work on philanthropy and charity in China, are in touch with Chinese foundations. They're in touch with Chinese corporates. They have permission from the Chinese state to organize delegations, to go abroad, to look at philanthropic opportunities, to talk about philanthropic policy in China, to talk about Tencent and other platforms, things like that. That's not necessarily true in some other places, but the academic community plays an important role in China. I think Cynthia and others know this extremely well. The other thing to say, again, something that's I think a little specific to China, is that the role of the Chinese embassies in terms of vetting, in terms of explaining policy in both directions, including to their own actors in China, who may not know much about Latin America, know much about Peru, but the role of the Chinese embassies, I don't think has ever been more important, at least since the 1970s or 80s. And so I think sometimes it is useful, and again, I think Cynthia and others understand this extremely well. It's very useful to be in touch with the Chinese embassies. You may have some hard conversations. Sometimes Chinese embassy personnel, we all know this, can be complicated or hard-nosed these days, sometimes very hard-nosed. But they, like the academic community, I think are really important bridges these days. I'll turn it over to Matthew.
I agree with Mark in terms of there's always an element of both, I think, from the original question. I actually have a quick question for you, if I may. One of the ways in which kind of philanthropy operates, I think, well in Latin America, and especially in Peru, is really close relationships with local governments. And I think maybe you guys can speak to that. And I know innumerable examples of this. In many ways, that's out of necessity because of, it's almost the reverse in China because there's so much kind of instability at the national government level in terms of just number of ministries that cycle through and just you always have to restart conversations. But once you develop kind of this local kind of grassroots relationship with local government, That's actually how things kind of get done philanthropically in Peru in these longer term relationships. And I'm curious, given how centralized China is, of course, it does filter down. There is local government. How does philanthropy operate at the local level? Because you said party state, right? But I have no idea, and I'm just curious what it looks like.
Local government's really important in China. China is a unitary system, so local government is clearly responding to national party and state policy. But local government in relationship to local philanthropy and foreign philanthropy where there are manufacturing or other plants in areas of China, local government is crucially important. Foreign philanthropy, companies that work in China that want to give at the local level, they would never go around local government. They would often go through local government and working either directly with local government or with approved charitable associations or other groups at the local level. I think coming abroad, the going out process from Chinese philanthropy, since we're at a pretty early stage of that, and the information we have is usually pretty fragmented information, we don't know as a matter of sort of general policy how that plays out abroad. It's why I think it's particularly important to get more and more case studies of what Chinese philanthropy is doing abroad. To what degree have they decided to work directly with local government? To what degree have they decided to work outside of local government with local civil society organizations or charitable groups? To what degree is this adaptive, to use sort of one of the current phrases? And China is on the ground through companies, for example, trying to figure this out. In which case, I do come back to the embassies and things like that, because the embassies would, to some degree, be giving companies guidance about when they should be working through local government, things like that. But for me, I have to say, it's a research question because we don't have a lot of good information about how this is actually playing out and the diversity of ways this may be playing out around the world. We do have the beginnings of Chinese philanthropy in Peru, in other places, in Africa, in Asia, close to China. From the case I mentioned that my colleague worked on, the recirculation case involving an international NGO developing a Chinese group that then decides to go abroad and is working with military social services in Thailand, something that is complicated for some of us to completely comprehend. That involves working with local government, clearly. But we don't know if that's playing out exactly the same way. We know that Chinese industry and Chinese economic groups moving abroad have been highly adaptive. And I would expect in general terms for the philanthropy that they engender to be adaptive as well. But in what directions that's going to happen, that's in effect a sort of new research question on which we need as many case studies and sort of people looking at that as possible.
Thank you, dear Mark. Thank you, dear Matthew. A continuación, tendremos las palabras de cierre de este evento a cargo de la doctora Cynthia Sanborn, directora del Centro de Estudios sobre China y Asia-Pacífico.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a Mark, gracias a Matthew, todos ustedes. Sentimientos encontrados. Mixed feelings, real mixed feelings. Dediqué muchos años de mi vida académica a estudiar y promover la filantropía estratégica y el fortalecimiento de la sociedad civil en América Latina. Y luego he dedicado bastante tiempo a entender China y ver cómo podemos conocer y mejorar las relaciones entre China y América Latina. Y no pensé que estas dos líneas de trabajo se iban a integrar de manera tan interesante. Gracias a la propuesta de Mark de venir acá, visitarnos, conocernos y intercambiar, ¿no? Un par de comentarios. El mundo hoy día enfrenta problemas globales de los más terribles. Estamos en un contexto de profunda y escandalosa desigualdad y concentración de riqueza y desigualdad en el mundo, dentro de nuestros países, dentro del mundo en general. Además de la pobreza que persiste en esos contextos. Encontramos un nivel de inseguridad profunda, tanto física como alimenticia, como en términos de crimen y violencia en nuestros países. Migración forzosa, refugiados, algo que Matthew trabaja mucho, gente obligada a huir porque no hay Estado que los protege. Y bueno, el cambio climático que tiene efectos devastadores en todos nuestros territorios y sobre nuestra gente. Y todos estos problemas son problemas globales, internacionales, lo cual debería ser fundamental que haya cooperación internacional, que solidaridad entre todos de parte de los estados y las sociedades. Y tenemos todo lo contrario, tenemos estas tensiones geopolíticas entre Estados Unidos y China, la fragmentación de las alianzas tradicionales de todo tipo, que exacerban estos problemas en vez de ayudarnos a solucionarlos, ¿no? Entonces, pienso, bueno, sí necesitamos esta ciudadanía global de lo cual Gianfranco ha hablado, ¿no? Y dónde está, ¿no? Y creo que en estos espacios de filantropía, de sociedad civil, es necesario seguir insistiendo, buscando, ¿no? Cómo podemos superar estas tensiones que los estados están generando y cómo podemos crear estos espacios. En regímenes autoritarios como la de China, es mantener ciertos espacios, aunque sean muy reguladas y muy restringidas, porque son espacios en los cuales muchísimas personas, por lo que escucho, millones de personas se encuentran como apoyarse o manifestar alguna solidaridad. Y en nuestras sociedades donde tenemos democracia política, pero acciones autoritarias, también es necesario persistir, ¿no? Y no solo dinero, ¿no? Escucho a los colegas de la Misión Jesuita, como muchas ONGs que están sufriendo por la falta de flujo de fondos, pero no es eso, es también acción, no solamente donar, sino actuar, es el apoyo voluntario, el intercambio de ideas, el intercambio de talentos, ¿no? El intercambio people to people, que es algo que creo que Matthew empezó diciendo, el conocimiento verdadero surge de estos intercambios de las personas y de trabajar juntos. Entonces yo cerraría nomás diciendo que it's music to my ears, me alegra cuando Mark dice que falta data, falta investigación, y creo que el rol de la universidad es eso, podemos trabajar juntos en investigar estos fenómenos, entenderlos y avanzar los esfuerzos de reforzar sociedad civil. Un ejemplo, ¿no? Pensando en la Misión Jesuita, ¿cuánto nos falta en el Perú estas plataformas donde personas comunes y corrientes podemos donar de manera fácil en nuestro celular o de manera, o prestar algunas horas de nuestro tiempo, o prestar algunos talentos o bienes que tenemos? Yo sé que los peruanos son profundamente solidarios. Cuando hay llamadas en emergencias, todos salen a dar, ¿no? Pero ¿cómo podemos aprender de la experiencia china adaptada a nuestra necesidad de apoyar actividades alrededor del país? Es un ejemplo de muchos, ¿no? Tenemos maestros, tenemos estudiantes que quieren además hacer intercambio, conocer Asia, conocer China, y creo que hay mucho aquí que podemos hacer desde la universidad. Esto es solamente una primera visita de Mark, pero espero que haya un camino juntos hacia adelante. Muchísimas gracias a todos.